What's up, metal and heavy music fans? It's time to rank more modern death metal bands. Alright, we're going to kick things off with one of my modern day favorites, and that is Exocrine. These guys are just killing it. Good mix of like technical death metal, but with progressive tinges too, some sci-fi elements as well. Each album seems to have kind of like a little bit of a different conceptual framework, but they've just been dropping banger after banger. I caught on to them with Ascension, which is great. That's a very sci-fi themed one. And then they followed that up with Molten Giant, which is probably my favorite, just total crusher of an album, fitting to the like kaiju that's on the cover of that one. Maelstrom is also really good. I didn't like it as much as Molten Giant, but still really strong. And then they just dropped the Hybrid Suns, which is also fantastic. So they're just like knocking it out of the park, and I want to put them all the way up at perfection. It's rare that I throw such a relatively new band up to the top, but they have just not let me down even a little bit. And so if you have not checked out Exocrine and you're into stuff like Inferi and some other bands that we're getting into, that more kind of modern, technical, progressive death metal sound, then they are a must listen. All right, on the flip side, we have 200 Stab Wounds, and I've been seeing a lot of hype for this band. This was highly recommended. In fact, a lot of the bands I put on the list this time were ones that people recommended in the comments on the last video that I left out. So 200 Stab Wounds, a lot of people brought this up, and people were talking about this a lot when Slave to the Scalpel came out. Me personally, I'm just like, I'm not into the hype. Like, I don't really get it. I think it's fine. But like I said on the previous video, I'm not that into these kind of like resurgence, modern, old school death metal bands, if you can call them that, where they're just sort of like regurgitating the same sound. And I don't know, there's just nothing particularly special about it to me. Like, yeah, it goes hard. It's super aggressive, super heavy, but I'm going to put them in okay, not my thing.
Let the hate flow through you.
We can go with Revocation. So I actually got into these guys relatively late with the Outer Ones, but that ended up being one of my favorite death metal albums of that entire year. A good mix of progressive, but also like a lot of Lovecraft in there too, which thematically that's where the title comes from, and there's elements of that just coming through really well. Great atmosphere, good mix of styles, really dynamic. Now that said, I haven't loved all of their material, so that pulls it down a little bit for me. Maybe I just need more time for some of it to set in, but they've got several albums at this point. They're very popular. Me personally, on this particular list, I'm putting them at great just because they got beat out by some other stuff that we're going to get into. Speaking of which, let's talk Suffering Hour. Now, I love these guys, and I have a particular fondness for this very atmospheric, blackened death metal sound, and there's quite a few bands that are in this style that are making this list too, and very enjoyable, just harrowing atmosphere, that echoing, cavernous quality. And I particularly liked their first full length, In Passing Ascension, that just totally blew me away. I love that they have like this technical element to their sound too, but also roll in the doomier kind of just blah kind of side to it. And then they really impressed me too, because the Cyclic Reckoning was also very good, but now they've got Time's Withering Shadow, which is split with Malthusian, which is another band that probably could have made this list. But I picked just 20 to make it streamlined, and hey, there'll probably be, there's thousands of bands. I always get comments going, you forgot blah blah blah. I didn't forget shit. We'd be here all day if I was trying to go through every single band and make everyone happy. But long story short, I'm going to put these guys at fantastic because they've just been, again, they don't have that many releases, but they're all really strong. The EP that they put out too, and then that split, they're incorporating these weird, almost like spaghetti Western elements and some additional instrumentation. And I have a soft spot with bands that are able to incorporate something that really makes them sound fresh. All right, let's go with one that's probably going to be a little bit controversial. And I struggled with this one a little bit. We're doing Misery Index. Now, I really enjoyed doing the Misery Index tier list, so if you want my extended thoughts, you haven't seen it yet. I did a tier list on all their albums, and they're a really fun band. I especially enjoy Traitors and Heirs to Thievery. Really great stuff. The albums after that were a little bit, not 100% my taste, but they were good. And then Complete Control, their latest, is awesome. Like, really, really good stuff. That said, they got beat out by a lot of bands on this list. Like, I had them up higher, but the more I started adding the ones that I like more, and again, I think have that little special sauce, the more they got bumped down. Because ultimately, like, they kind of do the same thing. Like, there is a nice mix of, like, hardcore, grindcore, and death metal all together there, so it's fun, but it's just not really my go-to band, is really what it comes down to. So I think on their own, like, they're still really solid, which is, again, why I rename these tiers so that this is not, like, C tier. But I do just think, by comparison to some of these other bands, they're just good. If you disagree with me, let me know down in the comments and tell me why.
Inconceivable!
All right, another personal newer favorite here. We've got Sensory Amusia, who just dropped a new album too, but I initially got into them with their EP Bereavement, which is great. I kind of compared some of it to the Black Dahlia Murder, but now Breed Death is kind of in a similar realm as what I was describing with Exocrine, where there's technical, there's progressive, it's balls to the wall. There's some Misery Index kind of sound mixed in there. It's almost like a halfway point, I would say, between like Misery Index and Exocrine, bands like that. And I just think, honestly, they do that better. And I liked Breed Death better than I liked Complete Control, personally. So I'm going to put these guys at great tier. They don't have a lot of releases, so I can't really put them higher than that, but definitely a band to watch and one of my newest favorites. All right, let's do another top pick here. So another cavernous, intense, atmospheric death metal band, Altarage. So I've been recommending these guys, I believe they're out of Spain, to fans of Portal, which I also love and were on the previous list. But they kind of do a very similar sound, but a little bit more, I don't know, like a little bit more aggressive, a little bit less experimental, but there's definitely those weird, more avant-garde elements. A lot of their musicianship I frequently describe as sounding like chugging rusty machinery that's like struggling to turn over. And I just love that aesthetic. There's just something about it. And these guys too, they've got, I think, 4 albums now. Yeah, I got into them with their debut, and then they followed that up joining the Season of Mist ranks with Ending Hent, which is awesome. The Approaching Roar is super intense. And then their last one was Succumb, which wasn't my favorite. I feel like they kind of like hit a peak and went down a little bit, but they've all been really solid and really consistent too. And I love it. I can listen to it over and over again. I'm actually going to go ahead and put them at S tier. All right, another one that might be a little bit controversial, because I saw a lot of love for Abiotic down in the comments, and also when their last album came out. And that was where I actually got into these guys too, with Ikigai, which I'm probably mispronouncing. I thought it was an okay album. Like, it was good, but I didn't love it. Some people were raving about it and saying it was like one of the best death metal albums of the year, and I just didn't feel that. I liked it. I thought it was a little inconsistent. I thought there was some filler, and to be fair, I haven't had enough time to like really dig into some of their other albums, and I know they have quite a few. I was doing some research before this with some of the bands I was less familiar with, but for me right now, I'm putting them at good, but they could end up rising in the ranks depending on what I see from them moving forward. I do think that they're extremely talented. Ooh, let's talk about Fallujah. So I fell in love with these guys the first time I heard The Flesh Prevails. That is a must listen for, again, fans of that like progressive technical death metal, but they brought this whole atmospheric element that's just like, I feel like on another level, to the point where when I hear other bands doing that particular style now, I'll describe them as Fallujah-esque in a way, where they've got this like big atmospheric wall of sound just like constantly just surrounding you from all directions with some of the synth stuff, and it's just gorgeous. And they followed that up with Dreamless, which I also loved. But then unfortunately they went through a vocalist change and they dropped Undying Light, which I did not care for. It was one of my most disappointing albums of that year, and maybe even of all time. Like, I was really let down by that thing. And it wasn't just the vocalist's fault. Like, I didn't like his style as much as the previous guy, but also the instrumentation just wasn't there. But I am excited to hear the new stuff, because I liked the new single. I thought it was kind of putting them a little bit more back on track. And so they could have hit perfection, but that last album pulls them down a little bit for me. So I'm going to put them at fantastic. All right, Sanguisugabogg, which I'm also not confident that I'm saying their name right. Yeah, Tortured Whole, Some people really enjoyed this album. It seemed to be kind of divisive though. Some people loved it, some people hated it. The Metal Meltdown reviewed it. He was not a big fan of it. And I kind of concur, like, to me, it's just sort of boring. It's more of like stuff I've heard before and just not very interesting. But I do enjoy their sense of humor and the almost like Metalocalypse style music videos. And they seem like good dudes too, because they even like reposted the Metal Meltdown's review despite him just being absolutely scathing. So I like them. I like their sense of humor. I like the memes around this ridiculous logo that they have too. But ultimately, another one for me that's going at okay, not my thing. All right, Beyond Creation. Another, like, lots of bands on this list that are in that progressive technical kind of style. And so these guys kind of aligned somewhat with like Obscura too, who are on the previous list. I like that style a lot. And I know that's another divisive point too, where if that's not a style you're into, you're probably going to disagree with a lot of my rankings. And that's totally fine. I know plenty of people who watch who much prefer the more old school, gritty, grimy. And I like some of that. And again, I like the more atmospheric stuff. But I also like some more modern, pristine, polished kind of stuff. And I love really technical performances too, but it's got to be harnessed into good songwriting. And I feel like that is a difficult balance because you've got other bands, which, I should have included them on here, but they're more deathcore. Rings of Saturn has come up. I'm not a big Rings of Saturn fan because to me, it's like all wank and no substance. Like, it's just like being technical for the sake of being technical. Whereas a band like Beyond Creation, I feel like weaves it all into these massive sounding compositions that they're able to carry even these longer song lengths. Not one of my favorites on this list, but I'm going to put them about at the middle at great tier. Fleshgod Apocalypse. So I love me some extreme symphonic metal, and these guys are about the best you can get as far as symphonic death metal goes. I think Septic Flesh outranks them by a bit in my personal opinion, but if you want that more sort of like grandiose operatic side, then this is the way to go. And I remember the first time I heard them, I thought that they were just so much fun. And another one too, where they have a sense of humor. I love that they did a cover of Blue from Eiffel 65, especially as somebody who grew up in the 90s with that song. I think that came out and was played at like every middle school dance I was at.
How do you do, fellow kids?
But they've got a lot of solid albums, like moving in. They started as kind of just a standard technical death metal band. And then once they got to Agony, which is probably my personal favorite, that's where they got into these crazy sort of Wagnerian, as they say, symphonic elements. Labyrinth is a good one, even though it's a little bit overly dense, like the production's like kind of overbearing. And then King, I like that they improved the production, but then I felt like the songwriting was a little bit inconsistent on that one. And then Veleno, I absolutely love. Like, I think it's a great balance. The vocals on the operatic side aren't quite as strong, but I think the compositions are much more engaging, and I enjoy blasting that one all the way through. So not perfect, but definitely high up there for me. Again, I'm just a sucker for people who incorporate those symphonic elements. There's even a little tiny bit of that on the new Exocrine album that I really loved, but I'm going to put these guys at fantastic. All right, Bloodhunter. I've been raving about this band in a couple videos now, but they just dropped their latest stuff. I enjoyed the End of Faith that came out previously, and now they have Knowledge Was the Price, and as I've said before, if you like that Angela Gossow era Arch Enemy sound, Bloodhunter is the band for you, because they absolutely nail it. The songwriting's not always as tight, and the albums tend to be a little bit bloated. There's some filler, especially on the new one. It's definitely longer than it needs to be. But song for song, like, really killer stuff. Their guitar player, too, is just insane. And then Diva Satanica, I love, like, all the way from her performance all the way down to the costuming is just totally on point, what you want in a metal front person. And they just kill it with that. And I'm really excited to hopefully see them continue to gain traction, which is part of why I'm mentioning them in like every video. They didn't make it like super high on this list because again, it is sort of retreading familiar territory, and I saved the higher levels for some of the stuff that I felt like was a little bit more fresh. But I'm going to put them at least at good tier and pretty high up at that. All right, another banger here, Rivers of Nihil. So I also kind of got into these guys a little bit later with Where the Owls Know My Name. I believe it made my top 10 metal albums of the entire year, definitely. I have trouble even calling that a death metal album, though, because there's a lot of, like, sludge and kind of just straight progressive metal in there. But that's part of what I appreciate about them so much, is that, again, I give higher rankings to things that fuse other elements in their sound. And they've got, like, sludge, progressive on the newer one. They've got some industrial elements, too. And they do it so well, I think. Like, just very anthemic kind of introspective kind of music that just really gets me caught up in the moment. And I know The Work was a divisive album too, that some people loved or hated. I personally loved it. I loved that it wasn't just Owls Part 2 and they continue to do something different. I hope each album ends up being kind of different, even though I also would be interested to see them lean even more into the industrial songs, because they had some bangers on there that I can hear one of them like playing in my head as I'm saying this. So I'm putting them up at perfection out of all these, because I think they're one of the bands I'm the most stoked about moving forwards to see what they do next. Another bottom one, Cerebral Rot. I listened to this a bit when they were dropping their new album, and it's a good one. Grimy, disgusting, great atmosphere, well produced, probably even one of the better ones out of this crew, but still just kind of an okay, not my thing pick, because it's just, I've already heard so many albums like this before, and it just, I don't know, it doesn't do a whole lot for me. It just makes me wish I was listening to something from the old school. Back on the blackened death metal front, we have Sulphur Aeon, which I love. Gateway to the Antisphere. I think that came out like 2015, around there, I want to say. And just a killer, another like Lovecraftian themed album with the atmosphere to match perfectly. Like that just totally captured the scope of that, and everything sounded massive. Every song sounded like you were beholding these like massive elder gods before you. And very kind of behemoth-y, but with their own little twist on it. And so really good stuff there. They follow that up with The Scythe of Cosmic, which is okay. It's not nearly as good as Gateway to the Atmosphere. It's got some great songs on it, but it kind of like let me down a little bit. I was a bit overhyped, and it's been a little while since they dropped that. So I'm hoping that they rally and drop another banger, but definitely one that you should check out, especially Gateway to the Antisphere. I'm going to put them at good tier. All right, another one that's probably going to get a lot of disagreement from the people who aren't as into the more like modern tech death sound, but Cytotoxin, absolutely just ripping it up, like to shreds, I say. I love this German band's aesthetic with the whole like Chernobyl kind of vibe. Everything's radioactive, everything's exploding, and it's just like the drums hit so hard, the vocals are so intense. If you like Archspire, which was another one I ranked high on the other list, then you will love Cytotoxin if you not check them out. If you just love really intense technical death metal that sort of calls back a little bit to stuff like Dying Fetus, but also like brings it into the modern era and just like ramps up the RPMs, you can't really go wrong with Cytotoxin. Gamageddon is a killer album, and then Nuclear Earth was their last one, which was also very good. They've got 4 albums though, so definitely worth checking out. I'm actually going to put them up at fantastic. All right, Noctambulist. So those who enjoyed Ulcerate, who are on the previous list, you will love Noctambulist, especially their debut album, which is called Atmospheres of Desolation. Lots of Ulcerate vibes, and that's what drew me to them to begin with, and they are now friends of the channel. They were actually one of the earliest bands that I interviewed back when this channel was primarily just a podcast and platform for me to interview these bands. And I miss doing that sometimes, but it's hard to coordinate schedules, and I just don't have the time as much these days, but still stay in contact. And they followed that up with The Barren Form, which I've seen some people really enjoyed that. I'm glad to see their name popping up in comments now, and I just want to see them grow. I'm really impressed with them. That newer album had more of a black metal slant to it too. Like, I feel like the first one was pretty much pure technical ulcerate sounding death metal, whereas the new one has some of that, but it's shifted almost like 50% in favor of songs that almost feel like straight up just like technically tinged black metal. So awesome stuff, great atmosphere. I'm going to put them at great tier. Undeath was another band that was popular in the comments, and they just dropped It's Time to Rise from the Grave, which old school death metal fans seem to love. It's probably my favorite, actually, of these bands here at the bottom tier in terms of how they do it, and I think the songs are probably the most fun and catchy to me overall, but it's still, again, just not what I really want I was not overly enthused with it. I thought it was good. I think it's a fun album. I would recommend it, but ultimately it's something that I'm going to forget about pretty quickly. And then I debated including them at all since they did start far enough back, but they were new enough that they didn't make the old school death metal bands and albums tier lists. So somebody recommended them in the comments too, and I was like, all right, what the hell? I'm going to throw them on here. And y'all probably know where I'm going to put them. I could see arguments for them ending up on various levels of this list. And I could see them ending up a little bit lower too, because they do kind of like put out the same thing over and over again, sort of like what I said about the Black Dahlia murder. But goddamn, have they been so consistent. And when I looked over this list, ultimately, it's just like they got to be at perfection for me personally. They've never put out an album I didn't like. I know I've said a lot. I don't really care for Catch 33, but I don't think it's a bad or even just okay album. I still think that's a good album. Then you got stuff like Koloss, you got classic tracks like Future Breed Machine. They've just been monstrous. And their new album too, Immutable, I still love it. And again, I know some people, it's kind of like you're in or you're out with these guys, and that's totally fine. But me personally, I love them. They're probably my most listened to band on this list, which is a little unfair because they've been around the longest probably of most of these, but still, like, constantly playlisted. Every time, like, I'll hit shuffle on my phone, any Meshuggah song comes on, I am just like going nuts in the fucking car and rolling the windows down and cranking the volume up, guaranteed. So yeah, Meshuggah, perfection. Check out this video if you missed part 1, and check out this playlist for plenty more death metal related tier lists. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.